On January 4th, 2018, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, released its final net neutrality repeal order. This capped off months of discussion on the topic of net neutrality, which had previously come to a head on December 14th, 2017. But even before that, net neutrality had been floating around the political discourse for several years in one form or another. What exactly is net neutrality? Well, here's Wikipedia's definition. Net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers must treat all data on the internet the same, and not discriminate or charge differently by user, content, website, platform, application, type of attached equipment, or method of communication. For instance, under these principles, internet service providers are unable to intentionally block, slow down, or charge money for specific websites and online content. That sounds like a reasonable description of net neutrality to me, and at first glance, it would seem unthinkable that somebody would oppose these principles. In fact, if you were to take a good hard look at the history of ISP behaviors and FCC actions against these behaviors, since the beginning of the publicly available internet in the mid-1990s, it's not hard to see why so many people are supporters of net neutrality. In 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act. In Section 230, titled Protection for Private Blocking and Screening of Offensive Material, the legal status of the internet is brought up, with Congress taking an entirely hands-off approach regarding the regulation of the internet. A myriad of private lawsuits involving internet and tech companies began to build up, and when it became clear that the Telecommunications Act was providing no help, the FCC decided to commission a study of the internet in 1998. This study, titled the Cable Modem Order, released in 2002. In Section 3, a basic framework for the regulation of the internet was introduced, alongside a criticism of Congress and its 1996 Telecommunications Act for not properly handling the issue. The Communications Act does not clearly indicate how cable modem service should be classified or regulated. The relevant statutory provisions do not yield easy or obvious answers to the questions at hand, and the case law interpreting those provisions is extensive and complex. The technologies and business models used to provide cable modem service are also complex and are still evolving. As the Supreme Court recently observed in its connection with the Commission's interpretation of the Pole Attachment Act and its application to cable modem service, the subject matter here is technical, complex, and dynamic. And as a general rule, agencies have the authority to fill gaps where statutes are silent. As a follow-up to this, in 2005, the FCC released the Internet Policy Statement. Section 2 of this statement reads as follows. The Communications Act, passed in 1934, charges the Commission with regulating interstate and foreign commerce in communication by wire and radio. The Communications Act regulates telecommunications carriers, as common carriers, under Title II. Information service providers, by contrast, are not subject to mandatory common carrier regulation under Title II. The Commission, however, has jurisdiction to impose additional regulatory obligations under its Title I ancillary jurisdiction to regulate interstate and foreign communications. As a result, the Commission has jurisdiction necessary to ensure that providers of telecommunications for Internet access or Internet Protocol-enabled, IP-enabled services are operated in a neutral manner. Moreover, to ensure that broadband networks are widely deployed, open, affordable, and accessible to all consumers, the Commission adopts the following principles. To encourage broadband deployment and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public internet, consumers are entitled to access the lawful internet content of their choice. Consumers are entitled to run applications and use services of their choice, subject to the needs of law enforcement. Consumers are entitled to connect their choice of legal devices that do not harm the network. And consumers are entitled to competition among network providers, application and service providers, and content providers. This is all nicely summed up in Section 3. The Commission has a duty to preserve and promote the vibrant and open character of the Internet as the telecommunications marketplace enters the broadband age. And just so we're clear, services classified under Title I are information services, and subject to regulation by the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, while services classified under Title II are telecommunications services, or common carriers, and instead subject to FCC regulation. Title III refers to the regulation of signals to Earth-orbiting satellites, and Titles 4 through 6 discuss implementation of the law and special case scenarios. Title I information services are lightly regulated, while Title II common carriers are heavily regulated. A common carrier refers to a service provided to the general public without discrimination, for the greater public good, in contrast with private carriers, which have more freedom regarding who they serve and for what price. In 2010, during a lawsuit between Comcast and the FCC, the judge ruled that the FCC had overstepped its bounds in attempting to regulate Comcast's shitty business practices, because internet service providers, or ISPs, were regulated by the FTC under Title I, not the FCC under Title II. In response, the FCC released the Open Internet Order, and while it can be somewhat technical, a basic layman's description is provided in the preamble. To provide greater clarity and certainty regarding the continued freedom and openness of the internet, we adopt 3 basic rules that are grounded in broadly accepted internet norms, as well as our own prior decisions. 1. Transparency. Fixed and mobile broadband providers must disclose the network management practices, performance characteristics, and terms and conditions of their broadband services. 2. No blocking. Fixed broadband providers may not block lawful content, applications, services, or non-harmful devices. Mobile broadband providers may not block lawful websites or block applications that compete with their voice or video telephony services. 3. No unreasonable discrimination. Fixed broadband providers may not unreasonably discriminate in transmitting lawful network traffic. We believe these rules, applied with the contemporary principle of reasonable network management, will empower and protect consumers and innovators, while helping ensure that the internet continues to flourish with robust private investment and rapid innovation at both the core and the edge of the network. Soon after, Verizon sued the FCC under the same logic that they didn't have the right to regulate ISPs under Title II, as ISPs were designated Title I information services and not Title II common carriers. The judge would eventually rule in 2014 that while the court agreed that ISPs needed to be regulated in the manner that the FCC described, the FCC still didn't have the authority to do so, which would lead, in 2015, to the FCC reclassifying ISPs as common carriers under Title II with the support of President Obama. In 2015, the FCC released the Net Neutrality Order, outlining 3 specific practices that ISPs would need to follow going forward. 1. No blocking. A person engaged in the provision of broadband internet access service, insofar as such a person is so engaged, shall not block lawful content, applications, services, or non-harmful devices subject to reasonable network management. 2. No throttling. A person engaged in the provision of broadband internet access service, insofar as such person is so engaged, shall not impair or degrade lawful internet traffic on the basis of internet content, application, or service, or use of a non-harmful device, subject to reasonable network management. 3. No paid prioritization. A person engaged in the provision of broadband internet access service, insofar as a person is so engaged, shall not engage in paid prioritization. The logic of the first rule is self-evident. People expect to be able to access the whole internet when they pay their ISP for internet access. Rules 2 and 3 are built on the premise of Rule 1, that an extreme amount of throttling or paid prioritization would in practice violate Rule 1, and so to avoid a slippery slope situation, they simply axe those possibilities. And most recently in the timeline of events, in 2017, the FCC's current chairman, Ajit Pai, released an order putting ISPs back under Title I as information services and out from under Title II as common carriers, effectively reversing the 2015 net neutrality order. And it's this action that has made the internet lose its collective fucking minds. Now, a lot of net neutrality opponents make the argument that the internet was just fine before 2015, and that 2017's repeal is not going to bring humanity back into the dark ages. And that argument does have some weight to it. I'm sure we can all remember the internet pre-2015, and it was basically the same thing as it was after 2015. But at the same time, the pre-2015 internet wasn't a paradise either. In 2014, the Huffington Post released an article titled Net Blocking, a Problem in Need of a Solution. And in this article is a timeline of the many instances of ISPs not only blocking, throttling, or offering paid prioritization, but refusing to tell their customers about it. In 2005, a local Madison River ISP blocked the VoIP service Vonage. Comcast blocked all peer-to-peer applications, and TELUS blocked access to 766 individual websites that espoused political opinions that the management of TELUS personally disagreed with, including a website supporting a labor strike against TELUS. In 2007, AT&T forced Apple to block all VoIP applications on the iPhone, wanting people to use their phone services instead. In 2010, Windstream Communications began redirecting Google searches into their own proprietary search engine. In 2011, Metro PCs blocked streaming video from all sources except YouTube. The ISPs Cavalier, Cogent, Frontier, Fuse, DirectPC, RCN, and Wide Open West were found to be redirecting search queries through the proprietary search engine Paxfire, and AT&T, Sprint, and Verizon blocked access to Google Wallet in favor of their own online payment service, unfortunately named ISIS. In 2012, Verizon blocked free tethering applications in favor of its own $20 tethering service, and AT&T blocked access to FaceTime unless customers subscribed to a specific, more expensive payment plan. Oh yeah, and in 2013, Verizon explicitly admitted in court that the only reason they weren't just charging a whole whack of money for piecemeal downgraded internet services is due to the FCC's attempts to regulate it. Admittedly, some of these instances are from the mobile services of these companies and not their ISP division. However, even as their shitty internet practices were regulated from 2015 to 2017, their shitty mobile practices continued to degrade in quality. In this time, Verizon prevented third-party SIM cards from working, they blocked the Pay with PayPal app, the White Pages free caller ID app, and all radio FM apps. T-Mobile throttled speed on all unlimited plans, and a formal investigation into AT&T's business practices began. You would be a fool to think that these companies wouldn't do the same thing with their internet services if they could. So this is, as far as I can tell, the bulk of the pro-net neutrality argument. ISPs have a history of duplicitous business practices, and the FCC has been attempting to rein them in at every turn. The net neutrality principles of no blocking, no throttling, and no paid prioritization are ultimately in the public good, because they ensure that everyone gets access to the same internet. Net neutrality proponents often explain these principles with the highway analogy, with speed bumps in the slow lane and fast lanes open only for those who can afford to pay. But let's give the devil his due here. Let's take a look at what the opponents of net neutrality have to say. Well, first of all, the phrase opponents of net neutrality doesn't necessarily work in this context. There are a lot of people who are pro-net neutrality's principles and still believe that Ajit Pai's action to return ISPs to their pre-2015 Title I state was ultimately a good thing. These people still believe in the values of net neutrality, but ultimately believe that FTC regulation under Title I and not FCC regulation under Title II is the best way to get us there. Unfortunately, both the mainstream media and the new internet media, in a rare instance of cooperation between the two, has tarred and feathered anybody who dislikes Title II regulation of ISPs as an anti-net neutrality totalitarian dictator that simply wants to regulate the free and open internet into non-existence, while the actual situation is more nuanced than that. So let's take a look at the point of view of the Title I proponents. You know that long list in the Huffington Post listing the various misdeeds of the ISPs? Well, all of those cases prior to 2015 were actually successfully resolved using Title I regulation, and almost all of them in favor of the consumer. Title I seemed to be working just fine. Sure, the ISPs were trying some shady shit, but they weren't really getting away with it. And if the Title II argument is that Title II classification would prevent ISPs from even trying the shady shit in the first place, well, that's a pretty slippery slope to go down. I don't know about you, but insofar as government regulation is concerned in general, I would rather governments create a blacklist of grossly unethical practices, instead of a whitelist of pre-approved practices. Additionally, Title II proponents seem to believe that paid prioritization is a taboo, that all packets of data must be treated equally. But why? I mean, loading an email or a Reddit thread certainly doesn't require the same latency as playing video games online or watching Netflix or streaming to your audience. In any other industry, prioritizing resources based on need is a no-brainer. And then there's that famous Portugal internet package image, where Title II proponents say that this excessive bundling with restrictive data caps is where American ISPs will end up without regulation. Well, notwithstanding the fact that this Portuguese plan doesn't block access to specific types of content if you don't buy their specialized plans, but instead offers a faster connection for those types while still maintaining a basic minimum access that is reasonable, why do you think that this would happen? It didn't happen before 2015, when ISPs were under Title I. And do you think that an ISP would actually survive in the marketplace if it attempted to do this sort of thing? Its competitors would eat it alive. So with Title I out of the way, let's talk about the actual opponents of net neutrality. Not people who want FTC regulation under Title I, you know, the people who believe that a fully deregulated internet, where ISPs can just do whatever the fuck the market will let them get away with, is the best possible way forward. What's their reasoning? Well, a big one is that net neutrality stifles investment in innovation. This is a common free market capitalist argument, that excessive taxation, strict adherence to regulation, and large amounts of red tape all contribute to diminished returns on investments, and that eventually it becomes a net loss for a company to invest in its own business. Mark Anderson, the inventor of the world's first web browser software, said in an interview with the Washington Post that, "I think that a pure net neutrality view is difficult to sustain if you also want to have continued investment in broadband networks. If you're a large telecommunications company right now, you're spending on the order of $20 billion a year on capital expenditure. You need to know how you're going to get a return on that investment. If you have these pure net neutrality rules where you can never charge a company like Netflix anything, you're not ever going to get a return on continued network investment, which means you'll stop investing in the network. And I would not want to be sitting here 10 or 20 years from now with the same broadband speeds we're getting today." Additionally, the ability for new competitors to enter the market also becomes non-existent under net neutrality. The same costs that restrict larger ISPs' ability to invest in their own business prevent smaller competitors from springing up at all. They simply don't have the ability to start up a new business. In reality, net neutrality can actually promote monopolies and pricing cabals within the ISP market by making the cost of new competitors entering the market prohibitively high. The honest reality is, the physical infrastructure of the internet requires a lot of money to build and maintain, and somebody has to foot the bill for that. We've got four choices as to who: the ISPs, the consumers, the content providers, or the government. Having the government foot the bill would effectively nationalize the internet, and I don't think anybody wants that. Under Title II regulation, the ISPs are forced to foot the bill themselves. Net neutrality demands that all users, both the consumer and the content providers, pay the same rate no matter how much data they actually use. If consumers foot the bill, that means changing the internet package to something more like mobile packages, with data caps and speed regulations, and even at their worst, content regulations. It's obvious that consumers don't want this. Hell, I don't want this. But it's not inherently unfair. Imagine if electricity companies did away with the electricity meters on the side of everyone's houses and just charged us all a flat fee. Well, hey, that sounds good, right? Maybe in the short term it would be, at least for us. But eventually, the cost of providing simplistic on-off unmeasured access to everybody would become so high that either the system would collapse or the electricity companies would massively jack everyone's prices up regardless of usage just to cover their expenses. But what about that fourth option? Charging the content providers for the bandwidth that their consumers demand. I mean, sites like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix all gobble up way more bandwidth than email servers or personal websites or blogs. If we don't want to pass the cost on to the customers, and passing the cost on to the ISPs is untenable in the long term, why don't these large tech companies pay their way? Why don't they invest in the infrastructure that makes their businesses viable in the first place? Maybe this is why every single time the topic of net neutrality comes up, every single tech giant speaks out in favor of it. Maybe it's because one of the more viable alternatives to a pure net neutrality is one that allows the ISPs to recoup their investment costs, but places the burden of cost on these tech giants instead of on the consumers. I mean, these companies certainly are not pro-net neutrality out of some ideological stance regarding the free and open nature of the internet. All the big social network platforms are just fine with regulating the internet, as long as they are the ones doing the regulating. We already know from Project Veritas that YouTube manipulates search algorithms so that pre-approved, curated content reaches the front page, the trending list, and so on. We already know the debacle that YouTube's yellow monetization sign limited state bullshit has become. We already know that Google uses its power to quash ideas it doesn't like. Here's some excerpts from an article of the same name. The Google salespeople were encouraging Forbes to add Google Plus's social buttons to articles on the site, alongside the Facebook Like button and the Reddit Share button. They said it was important to do so because the Plus recommendations would be a factor in search results, a crucial source of traffic to publishers. This sounded like a news story to me. Google's dominance in search and news gave it tremendous power over publishers. By tying search results to the use of Google+, Google was using that muscle to force people to promote its social network. I asked the Google people if I understood correctly. If a publisher didn't want a +1 button on the page, its search results would suffer? The answer was yes. With that, I published a story headlined "Stick Google Plus buttons on your pages or your surf traffic suffers" that included bits of conversation from the meeting. Google promptly flipped out. They never challenged the accuracy of the reporting. Instead, a Google spokesperson told me that I needed to unpublish the story because the meeting had been confidential, and that the information discussed there had been subject to a non-disclosure agreement between Google and Forbes. I had signed no such agreement, hadn't been told the meeting was confidential, and I had identified myself as a journalist. It escalated quickly from there. I was told by my higher-ups at Forbes that Google representatives called them saying that the article was problematic and had to come down. The implication was that it might have consequences for Forbes, a troubling possibility given how much traffic came through Google searches and Google News. We already know that Google AdSense has threatened to remove all ad revenue from and disable the account of thelibertyconservative.com if they do not censor their content to Google standards. We already know that YouTube has demonetized all content on its platform regarding the Mandalay Bay shooting, even content where their ad revenue was meant to go to charity, with the official response of, "No matter the intent, our policy is to not run ads on videos about tragedies," except when Jimmy Kimmel's video on that same shooting has ads on it. And though this is anecdotal and entirely my own subjective experience, I've noticed that YouTube is far more likely to approve a request to remove the limited monetization state if the video in question has non-skippable ads enabled. I might do a full video on YouTube's shitty practices sometime. There's actually some depth to the topic. We already know Facebook and Twitter are both extremely one-sided in who they ban, what content they allow, what content they promote, and which creators they curate. And what I stated would happen in one of my previous videos, the balkanization of technology, is coming to pass. Free speech alternatives to the big names in internet services are cropping up. They're fighting an uphill battle, to be sure, but people are honestly just tired of being censored by the Reddits and Twitters and Facebooks of the world. So, yeah, anytime a big tech giant makes a post about net neutrality, just tell them to fuck off. They don't want net neutrality. They want to hold the reins instead of the government or the ISPs. And maybe, just maybe, there's another reason why. Maybe it's because under Title I, the FTC has the jurisdiction to enforce antitrust and other anti-monopoly laws on these tech giants. Not just the ISPs, but the Twitters and YouTubes and Facebooks of the world. Yeah, that would be a pretty big reason for these companies to fear Title I regulation, wouldn't it? Can the case be made that Apple or Google or Facebook hold monopolies in their specific markets? Maybe. And there's other arguments as well. Let's take a look at Marsh V Alabama, a 1946 U.S. Supreme Court case. In the case, the town of Chickasaw was entirely privately owned by the Gulf Shipbuilding Corporation. Though all buildings and roads within the town were company-owned, the roads connected to the state-owned highway and allowed non-employees to pass through the town and use civil services. Miss Marsh, a Jehovah's Witness, attempted to distribute religious material on the sidewalk in Chickasaw and was arrested on the grounds that because the entire town was privately owned, free speech rights did not apply. The case went to the Supreme Court, where it was ruled that because the Gulf Shipbuilding Corporation held an absolute monopoly on what was colloquially referred to as the town square, that it in function took the role of a municipality. The claim of private property was rejected on the grounds that the Gulf Shipbuilding Corporation had provided access to the town and its infrastructure to any passerby in the past, like a municipality would. And as a municipality, they were bound to uphold the Constitution. In 1996, the Marsh v. Alabama case was raised during the Cyber Promotions v. America Online case. Cyber Promotions wanted to send spam email to all email addresses that ended in @AOL.com. America Online decided to block all emails from Cyber Promotions at the ISP level. Cyber Promotions argued that Marsh v. Alabama set a precedent that private property, if sufficiently opened up to the public to the point that a monopoly on communication existed, must allow for free speech under the previous town square principle. The court disagreed, because AOL servers were only open to the public insofar as they were AOL customers, and this decision paved the way for the legality of the spam filter. But can that same case be made for Facebook or Twitter? Sure, these services are only available to people if they log into their accounts, but unlike AOL servers, it costs nothing to create these accounts. Unlike Netflix, which is a paid service, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube are all caught in the Marsh v. Alabama bind. They're all private entities that hold an absolute monopoly on free speech within their jurisdiction, and they're entirely open to the public, just like Chickasaw was. Maybe the way forward for net neutrality's principles isn't Title II. Maybe it's recognizing the internet as a town square and forcing all of its constituent parts, not just one slice of them, to conform to constitutional law. Of course, if you were to talk to any Title II diehard about any point I've brought up in this video, even the pro-net neutrality points that are anti-Title II, they would treat you like the neo-Nazi, Trump-supporting piece of bigoted capitalist scum that you obviously are. Oh yeah, guys, net neutrality is a race issue, right? Communities of color disproportionately affected? Even if the only change to the internet under Title I is that ISPs offer people even better internet if they can afford it? Well, of course. Internet communism demands that everyone has dial-up in order to avoid inequality. The repeal of net neutrality is an attack on the LGBTQ community? Don't worry, guys. You can still access Grindr on your mobile plan. Dox Ajit Pai's kids? Yeah, sure, why the fuck not? I wonder if all these people who are irrationally pro-Title II net neutrality remember SOPA and PIPA. Yeah, remember that shit? Remember when the government tried to regulate the internet and everyone lost their minds over it? Remember the outcry against the NSA? What happened that made you guys suddenly beg and kick and scream for government regulation of the internet? And you know, now that we're on the topic of going completely off the rails into insanity land, I'd like to present you with a crackpot conspiracy theory and let you make up your own mind about it. Title II regulation allows the government to force ISPs into obtaining broadcasting licenses, like with radio and TV. Obama pushes for this classification in 2015, along with other SOPA and PIPA provisions that were rejected by the electorate. This package of shit is rebranded as net neutrality, and ISPs get placed under the Title II umbrella. On December 23, 2016, Obama signs the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act into law. As a bundle, this act also contains the Countering Information Warfare Act, introduced by Congress on May 10, 2016. Let's take a peek at it. The Secretary of State, in coordination with the Secretary of Defense and the heads of other relevant federal departments and agencies, shall establish within the Department of State a Global Engagement Center in this section referred to as the Center. The purpose of the Center shall be to analyze relevant information, data, analysis, and analytics from United States government agencies, United States allies and partner nations, think tanks, academic institutions, civil society groups, and other non-governmental organizations in order to lead, synchronize, and coordinate efforts of the federal government to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining United States national security interests. The legislation declares that the head of the center will be housed within the White House instead of being independent like most other centers created in this way, that the head will answer directly to the president, and that the center will allow the president to use whole-of-government approaches to combat what it labels as basically fake news. Maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but just think about it for a minute. ISPs are required to have broadcast licenses under Title II. ISPs become legally required to take down whatever the Global Engagement Center, or the Center, deems as state or non-state propaganda, meaning not just Russian or Chinese propaganda efforts, but your posts to the Donald, the Breitbart articles you read, the 4chan boards you lurk. If the ISP refuses to do so, the FCC revokes their broadcasting license. And around the same time all this stuff is being pushed through Congress, social media companies start revving up their internal policing, like Twitter partnering with Crash Override, or the Google Ideas team being full of SJWs, and others. And these groups are getting played into this legislation as well. The center can declare those groups as third-party fact-checkers because business considers them to be. And the center can use their standards to force ISPs under Title II to remove content and restrict access based on the individual being a propagandist. And over the past 5 years, the internet-using public has largely become acclimatized to this idea. We find social media platforms having third-party fact-checking teams, fake news combatants, and hate speech provisions as silly, but not silly enough for a large-scale boycott. The idea of regulating the internet has shifted from unpopular to necessary, SOPA to net neutrality. And just like I said in a previous video, the free speech problem, blocking hate speech is now considered a more primary right than allowing free speech. To make this go fully into tinfoil hat territory, let me present one more quote from this piece of legislation. The center shall terminate on the date that is 8 years after the date of the enactment of this act. Obama thought Hillary would win, so much so that he entrusted her upcoming presidency with the power to declare anything on the internet or in the media as fake news, and not only censor it, but revoke internet access to both individuals and organizations, because the center is legally obligated to listen to the radical left-leaning fact-checking teams within tech giants that label anything against their views as fascism and Nazism, and they can do all of this without a court order. Now I know this is all just a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, but there's just enough actual legislation to make you think about it for a minute. And on this issue, I am actually glad Donald Trump won the election. Under his direction, Ajit Pai has reclassified ISPs as Title I, and the only mention of fake news from his administration has been him shitposting about it on Twitter. Ultimately, I believe that the internet does need some common sense regulation, but I don't think that Title II is the way to go. Personally, I believe that 2 of the 3 net neutrality principles are ultimately good for consumers. No blocking and no throttling, while the third, no paid prioritization, is probably bad for consumers in the long run. I personally like the idea of being able to pay more for hyperfast internet, or specialized usage packages that provide good specific benefits while still maintaining a solid minimum level of quality. And hey, while I was recording this script, it came out that the US Senate is trying a last-ditch attempt to keep the Title II regulation on the books. Though of course, the media bills this not as Title II, but as net neutrality. I guess you can see what side they've chosen. In any case, it's not over yet. But I hope I've done an accurate enough job at presenting the case for Title II regulation, Title I regulation, and no regulation at all, and I recommend you all come to your own conclusions. I just personally think that none of these options are going to be good enough for the health of the internet. Not in the long term. We need something new.